We're very happy to welcome you for this second webinar on beavers, an ally for areas in the context of climate change, organized by the University Research Organization H2O Lyon and Réseau Rivière. So for those who were not with us last time, H2O Lyon is a university and research school bringing together labs working on freshwater and systems in Lyon and Saint-Étienne. It's financed by the state in order to encourage links between training and research at master's and doctoral level between the socioeconomic world and the world of research. Well, it's also about connecting up with the international world. And it's about encouraging multidisciplinarity, which is necessary when it comes to the complex questions surrounding water. So in this context, we organize regularly seminars and webinars with different partners. We've already organized different things with Réseau Rivière, and that's where the idea of organizing these two webinars on beavers came to the fore. The first webinar took place last week, and this is the second webinar. I'm now going to hand over to Antoine, who is going to present Réseau Rivière. Antoine, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Claire-Lise. So as you say, so it's a long-term partnership that we have. Today, Réseau Rivière RRTV brings together different regional networks, different river technicians and scientists, leading to online or physical events. So today, this makes concrete some things that have been done in the field on beavers. So it's the year of the beaver this year. So there will be a visit tomorrow, and it's part of different initiatives organized by Yoann, Christof, who are our speakers today. So what I suggest is that I hand over straight away, without further ado, to our first speaker. Perhaps you could explain the rules of the webinar, Claire-Lise. Yes, just to remind you. So last week, if you weren't with us, there was a first webinar on beavers. On when it comes to restoration, there will be a replay available. And today, we're going to be looking at another aspect, and that is the management of beavers, feedback, and knowledge sharing. So we'll have some feedback from France with Yoann Bressan from the OFB. We will have some feedback from Switzerland with Christof Angst. And then we'll have some feedback from the United States with Emily Fairfax, who is a researcher at the University of Minnesota. And I'm going to welcome now Samuel Bergeau, who will be working with Antoine on the questions and answers. Samuel, could you just say hello to us and maybe say a few words about the thesis that you are currently working on? Yes, hello, everybody. So Samuel Bergeon, I'm a PhD student at H2O Lyon. I work on the contribution and of different alternative methods to face the challenges of drought in medium-sized mountain areas. So there's the question of imitating beavers and our relationship with beavers. And the basic question is to know how these different ways of doing things can contribute to transforming governance and management of water. How can we reshuffle the cards, basically? Thank you very much. So I'm now going to hand over to our first speaker.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Good afternoon to all of you. So just to start with, Yoann Bressan, I'm a research lead on semi-aquatic animals and specializing in beavers within the Office Français de Biodiversity, so the Biodiversity Agency in France. And my topic is about conservation and management of species. and I will deliver a short presentation. I will be talking about the story and history of beavers in France. And I will be focusing on the impact of beavers since it has been reintroduced for many years and decades. So let's have a look at the presence of beavers in France in the past and what it is now. And beavers have come back at the start of the 20th century. I mean, they started to come back at the start of the 20th century, and the environmental situation has to be taken into account, especially with the development of human activities. Historically, the European beavers were largely widespread on the European continent and in Asia. And it started to decline as of the 12th century, and for many reasons. And it almost vanished into thin air in the 20th century, in early 20th century. Have a look at those maps. I mean, these are illustrative maps that will show you the decline of beavers. And in France, beavers started to decline in the 17th century, and at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, the population of beavers, I mean, almost disappeared for good. Dozens of beavers were located and identified in the Rhone-based basin area. Why did it decline? These beavers were present, were widespread, but why did they disappear? Direct destruction through hunting, trapping, entrapment for fur. There's a small picture here. You can see Napoleon with his hat. Beaver made felt hat being worn by Napoleon, and the castoreum was also used. Is a substance that was used in the fragrance industry, in traditional pharmacopoeia as well. So beavers were hunted for those attributes, and the beavers were hunted for meat. It's a semi-aquatic animal, and the tail is made with scales, and beavers were considered to be a fish. So in fact, you could eat beavers during Lent and on Fridays. And of course, they were trapped, they were destroyed because beavers engendered damage and they were considered to be harmful. And that's why they were destroyed. And there's another factor in decline, degradation of habitats. You can see the different developments. So hydroelectric developments, hydroelectric structures have hampered beavers, and that's why the beavers couldn't move much. So at the end of the 19th century, the species almost disappeared. But in Europe, there was an awareness raising process. In naturalistic companies, and first protective measures were taken. So there were some early measures that were taken, especially in Scandinavian countries. The beavers started to be protected. And in France, the first protective measure that was taken, the end of the destruction bonus, and they were enacted in 1869, and it was forbidden to destroy and kill beavers in the Bouches-du-Rhône, Gare, Vaucluse departments. It was back in 1909, and it was prohibited to destroy beavers in 1926 in Drôme, in the Drôme department. And then at the national level, there was a regulatory protection for beavers in 1968. So these protection measures made it possible for the beavers, to recolonize the Rhone River basin, and especially the tributaries and stream of the Rhone River. And this natural recolonization was supported in 1950 and 2002 by reintroduction measures. You can see the numbers. These are the numbers of the reintroduction campaigns that took place in France. It's not in chronological order, but so these two events combined made it possible for beavers to recolonize some of the lost territories. So I hope that this animated sequence will work, says the speaker, but so the watersheds are being recolonized, but there are still holes and gaps, as you can see. And it's a success story, so to speak, in terms of protection, in terms of conservation of the beavers. And there are lots of benefits. So beavers, as you know, beavers are ecosystem engineers. They will modify the environment through their activities, and they will adapt the environments and settings to their needs and requirements. And especially if you look at those dams, and so they can cut trees and they will feed on trees, and the main effects were measured with dams, effects on the hydromorphology of streams. The habitats will be revitalized and the animal and plant-based communities will be diversified. And this will benefit the ecosystem. So diversification of available habitats within a pond or within a watershed. As I said, the environmental situation has changed versus the situation that prevailed in the past. I mean, ecosystems have been changed and altered by human-made activities. So beavers are back in some anthropized areas. So farming, industrial places are colonized at times by beavers, and so there's a conflict with human-made activities. So they will feed on plants, or so you can see the damage that can be done here on the right-hand side. This is a poplar at the top, vineyards and orchards as well. They can damage all these areas. We can damage corn fields. And in addition to those those direct damage, you have indirect damage as well, brought about by floods due to dams built by beavers. So the beavers, will build dams, and the level of the river will go up, and then the river can overflow their banks. And on the banks, you have farming activities, you have facilities, amenities, infrastructures. So floods can be conducive to damage done by beavers, damage to human activities, and these dams can obstruct and clog the flows, the river flows. Have a look at that. So the beaver clogged this a rainwater drain, a rainwater channel, and when the rainwater goes up, this can bring about some floods and flooding. So how can we make sure that beavers can remain on their different spots? How can beavers live, and how can we mitigate the damage to human activities. Regarding direct damage, there are some technical solutions that could be very efficient when they are implemented, when they are followed up, when they are monitored. And of course, it's the same principle. So you will put a physical barrier between the beaver and the activities that we want to protect here at the bottom. This is a field of poplars. There's a physical fence. It's a fence around the tree, and the beaver cannot gnaw at the trees. So you can use fences that will be positioned around a plot of land. And on the whole, of these measures can be very efficient and efficacious in order to protect the crops and trees. Of course, you may have some conflicts of usage as well, much more difficult to manage from a regulatory point of view, because the dam is a dam. So the habitat is being protected here, and the habitat here is being created by the beavers. So when you want to work on a dam, you need to get a waiver, a specific authorization for protection purposes, and there are some technical constraints. There are some measures that are advocated in order to be efficient. It's important, I mean, to maintain the fences, the dams. So I can tell you that a beaver is relatively stubborn, and when you work on a beaver's dam, you will reduce the height of a dam in order to reduce the quantity of water upstream, and the beaver will repeatedly plug the holes on the dam. Have a look at this example on the right-hand side. The dam here. So here we worked in order to make sure that water could be evacuated, and in order to prevent the beavers from coming back, we put an electric fence with a battery that you can see here, bottom right of the slide. So it was efficient, it worked well, the beaver didn't come back, but so the battery had to be changed 4 times in a period of 2 months, because this is a stream, so electricity and water, I mean, this is not always good, and there are some branches that were brought by the tide, so hitting the wires, and the battery emptied very quickly, and from time to time batteries are being stolen as well. It's not a very good idea to have those batteries in open air, but there are other measures that we've used, siphons as well. So it's important, I mean, to maintain the equipment and to service the equipment. Regarding the different types of damage, in terms of damage management, in terms of damage protection, the owner will have to incur the expenses, or the complainant will have to incur the expenses. There is no specific funding for that. So for beavers and human beings to live side by side, it's complex, but there's a need for consultation. So I've tried to list the people who should be around the table when there are some problems of coexistence between beavers and human beings. And these problems and issues can be quite acute. So the Office Français de la Biodiversité, the French Bureau of Biodiversity, I'm just pitching my organization. There's a beavers network. It is coordinated by OFB. in charge of making some observations and bringing some recommendations in terms of protection. And OFB is in charge of enforcing the law. It's like environmental police. So the managers of environment, should be around the table, local authorities, rivers, associations, managers of protected sites, administrations, local authorities, and all of the people involved in the regions, so associations of nature, hunters, fishermen, people in the neighborhood. There are lots of discussions that could be quite stormy at times. And I think that it's important to bring together all these people if we are to make sure that beavers and human beings live side by side peacefully. And in order to move along those lines, we are working the National Society of Nature Protection and with the French Society for the Protection of Mammals. And we want to draft an action plan for beavers, not for beavers themselves, at a national scale, at a European scale. Beavers are protected and they are gaining ground. But it's a matter of coexistence between beavers and human beings, and we need to take into account the protection of beavers, the role of beavers in the dynamics of ecosystem, the role of beavers in improving the natural ecosystem. So we are trying to come up with an action plan, a socio-ecosystemic approach. So the idea here is to better take into account the beaver when it comes to managing and restoring the settings and environments. So we want to organize and to bring together all of these stakeholders, all the people involved in the management of beavers. So to end my presentation, as it was said earlier, so upon the initiative of the SNPEN, on the occasion of the 50 years anniversary of the reintroduction of beavers on the River Loire, we've decided to organize events for the Beavers Year. Some events, had been organized and they started in April until summer 2025. So there are lots of events, lots of activities with beavers at a national, regional level. And during the Beaver Year, on December the 12th and the 13th in Blois, we will organize a national symposium on beavers. So as you can see on the right-hand side, so this is a call for papers, that I will send you. So if you want to deliver some papers during this symposium, don't hesitate. I will send you the document. It's a call for proposals document, or a call for papers document. I hope that have been exhaustive enough.
Passer aux questions, du coup, donc n'hésitez pas à les inscrire dans le chat, comme on disait tout à l'heure. Il y en avait une première déjà d'Antoine qui demandait combien de réintroductions dans le passé il y avait eu en France et quels enseignements on pouvait en tirer.
Alors, il y a eu en dessous.
How many reintroductions in the past? 26 reintroduction were organized, and I want so 26 reintroduction operations, and they were conducted with beavers that were captured on the Rhone River basin. So French beavers, as it were, if I could put it this way, says the speaker. And regarding the learnings and the lessons learned, it depends on the kind of learning that you want to draw, the kind of lessons that you want to draw. They were not all successful. And in general, some beavers were introduced, but we didn't know the gender of some of the beavers, so we failed to a certain extent, but nonetheless, there were some success stories. Some beaver populations managed to recolonize the areas. Regarding this topic, there's something that you need to put in perspective. So the beavers return can raise some issues in terms of usage. And the process, I mean, should be supported, and acceptance, social acceptance is important. So local communication campaigns have to be conducted to help reintroduce beavers. A thesis was drafted by a student at Lille University, Benedict Fancter, and she worked on the reintroduction of beavers in Moselle department, and she conducted a sociological survey. And 10 years later, locally, when the beavers were introduced, a lot of work has been done in terms of communication. Local schools were involved, local authorities were fully involved, and 10 years after, the impact was felt. So beavers were well accepted with a positive image, but conversely, in the Vosges, there was no reintroduction process, but beavers came back naturally, but there was no communication, there was no social communication in the Vosges area, and beavers are not really well perceived, well seen by the developers, with a kind of negative image, even though there aren't too many differences in terms of impact. But the social and communication dimension is key. This is one of the key learnings that we need to draw from the reintroduction activities. Of course, there are some technical and biological issues, but if you want a reintroduction process to be successful, it's important to talk to people, to communicate with people, and we have to make sure that local people, local populations understand, buy into this reintroduction policy in the long term. So it takes time, of course, but it's absolutely pivotal, I mean, to take on board all the people. Thanks a lot for your answer, Jérôme Duval. So there are a few survivors. If you consider the French beavers, maybe there's a lack of genetic diversity for the future, because all these beavers are almost French beavers. That's a very good question, but we'll be publishing some findings and results. We will be publishing a study about the genetics of beavers population in France. And as you might expect, the genetic diversity of French beavers is very low, very low, but it has been said. So there were about 10 or so beavers at the start of the 20th century, and all the reintroduction processes were carried out from a few individuals. So on the Loire Basin River, number 12 here, so the reintroduction process that was conducted at the end of the 1970s, so 12 beavers. And from these 12 individuals, we have lots of beavers from Nantes, on the River Loire, and the Loire River and the main tributaries. If you consider the northeastern part, we've got extra beavers coming from Belgium, Luxembourg, and Switzerland as well. So the reintroduction process was done mixing the subspecies, so genetic diversity is higher. So we have those beaver populations that came into France, and we have a diversity of genetic components now. So beavers can stand with this low genetic diversity, but it's an interesting risk in terms of long-term conservation of beavers, things that we need to take into account when it comes to managing the beavers. Two other questions, two additional questions. Mathieu Gillet, any reintroduction projects in France, especially in some basins that are not colonized by beavers? What are the procedures to be followed in terms of reintroduction? As far as I know, the only ongoing project is in Ariège, a reintroduction process in Ariège was said. Of course, you need to work with the different divisions, housing divisions, environment divisions, and they're in charge of these issues. But of course, you can get a waiver to reintroduce beavers into the environment, into these specific settings. So you need a waiver because you are not allowed to reintroduce beavers in some settings, in some natural settings, and there's a decree. So you need to provide some justificatory documents highlighting why is it relevant to reintroduce beavers, regarding the protection of beavers and the conservation of beavers. When you think about the beavers population, there is no short-term, medium threat regarding the conservation of beavers, in fact. So there's a project in Ariège, but I know that the project leaders are following us. So it's a matter of highlighting the role of beavers in ecosystems, the role they play in ecosystems. So it's important to come up with explanatory, relevant, judicious explanations. As I said earlier, you have to consider the socio-economic dimension, coexistence between beavers and human beings, and this factor shouldn't be set aside. For example, in Belgium, or our colleagues in Spain, so there were some reintroduction projects that were carried out, and years after, the situation is not easy in terms of beavers management and coexistence between beavers and human beings. And why? Because at the start, I mean, there was no initial discussion, there was no initial consultation between the authorities and the population. I don't know if I've answered the question. There are some regulatory, environmental, sociological, social dimensions, I mean, to take into account. Very last question before we move to the next topic, the next paper. The negative factors of beavers. We've talked about positive beavers in terms of biodiversity. What are the negative comments? In Belgium, we have lots of problems and issues, especially for oligotrophic environment and settings and environments and drought, the negative side of beavers on ecosystems. Yes. So most of the time we talk about dams and the effect of dams, but we have a kind of overall approach. So on a watershed, beavers have a positive effect, especially with their dams. But it's not all black and white. When for example, when there's a dam, some spawning areas might be diluted. For example, trout might be affected. I mean, other species could be affected as well because of the beaver's dam. And you have some species that are very fragile and hence some negative effects. It's just a matter of scale in terms of time and space. This is what I wanted to tell you. I've told you that beavers are back, but in ecosystems that are fully different to those prevailing 300 years ago, 400 years ago. This is the case for crayfish, for mussels, river mussels, and dams can have a negative impact on some species, hence some issues and problems. Good. So Christof, now go ahead.
So for 18 years, I've been working for the Pastoral Advisory Department in charge of coordination in Switzerland. For 2 years, I've been working with Cécile Vincent. We're doing this presentation together. So I'm going to present to you how we're trying to manage conflicts or manage beavers in our landscape. And you'll see that we are all facing the same problems. We're all working on the same measures. But there was a transition towards the idea of using beavers to promote biodiversity, and that's what I'm going to show you now. So let's talk about the status of the beaver, the conflicts. Well, we've already heard about conflicts from our colleague. And something that's very important is the fact that we need clear rules. We need clear legislation. We need a plan that governs everything, that applies to everybody. If we don't have this kind of thing, there will just be continuous discussions. So I'm going to do a quick summary of something that's already been presented several times during the webinar. But in my opinion, if we don't solve problems related to conflicts of use, then it's going to be difficult to integrate beavers and preserve biodiversity. So the distribution of the beaver in the 19th century, there were about 100 million beavers before, and only 1,300 were left in France, Germany, Norway, and Russia after unchecked hunting. So we almost eradicated the species. We started reintroductions in Switzerland as of the 1950s, and for 20 years, we released about 141 beavers. In red, we've got the small population in France, in Norway, and Russia. So you can see the distribution and the reintroductions. So for 20 years, very few individuals, and about half of them disappeared or were found dead after just a few weeks of being reintroduced. So the population really did go down to something very small. In Switzerland, at federal level, the beaver was protected in 1962. And in Switzerland, just like in France and other parts of Europe, it's not just a species that's protected, but also its structures, including dams. So that's important when it comes to managing conflicts. And then every 15 years, there was a national census that was carried out. And here we're seeing the distribution map for Switzerland in 1978. And you can see in orange, you can see the family territories, you can see the solitary and couple territories. And we're seeing the same things. We look at the same things to look at the situation. In the 70s, there were fewer beavers than those that were released from an individual point of view. In 1993, already, there were 454 individuals shared across those small populations, and the red list, they were on the red list as a species threatened by extinction. And it really was quite threatened across the whole Swiss area. In 2008, my first job was to do the third census, and we found 1,600 individuals. So that was already more of a favorable situation. On the big rivers, the beavers were doing well, and at that time, they started to recolonize small watercourses and tributaries. And then 2 years ago, we did the fourth national census, and we found about 5,000 individuals over 1,400 territories. You can see the numbers are going up. Only in Italy do you have one or two individuals that are present. And in France and Germany and Austria, we've got the same picture more or less. Since 2022, so the second red list for mammals, the beaver is no longer listed as a threatened species, but it's still protected at federal level. That's very important. So what about conflicts then in our landscape? As Yoann showed us, in Switzerland, the most important thing is the collapse of roads when they dig under roads. And in Switzerland, there were 3 cases here where beavers live on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, there might be a road that is directly connected to the bank. And so they dig under them to make their burrows. Sometimes they also are present in small watercourses, and this can damage crops. On the left-hand side, you've got the flooding of an agricultural field. And another problem that we don't always see very quickly concerns drainage systems, invisible drainage systems. When they build dams on small watercourses and they block the drainage systems, and the water is no longer evacuated that way, and the water floods the farmers' fields. And so farmers can't work their fields anymore. So where are these problems? Well, the further away we are from the watercourse on the left here, the fewer problems we have. And the closer we are to the watercourse, the more problems we have. And in Switzerland, everything happens within 10 to 20 meters of the watercourse, apart from drainage problems that can have influences covering 200 meters away from the watercourse. There are different prevention measures, electric fences, as Yoann mentioned, metal fencing, electrical fencing. We reimburse people in Switzerland. You can have artificial burrows, meshing, conducts in dams. These are technical interventions and they are short term, a bit like artificial burrows. But the basic problem is that the water courses, the way they are presented, the way they are, means that the beavers have an influence on habitats. And when the water courses don't have enough room, that's when problems arise and conflicts too. So we need clear and transparent rules. And what above all, we need sustainable rules. And now I'll talk about the Swiss legislation and the approach to conflict management, how we're trying to go about things, how we've gone about things already, and how we're trying to move towards something better in the future. So, at the top, we've got the federal law on hunting. So the federal law on hunting is a law that protects nature, protects species, with exceptions. Some species can be hunted. Beavers, when they create too much damage, for example, this may lead to interventions. In Article 2, the beaver is said to be protected, but the federal law also protects structures, so dams and beaver lodges. So the law on hunting is organized in such a way that it looks at different priorities. So it starts with protection, then it moves on to prevention, compensation, and the last measure concerns the interventions that are carried about, interventions on structures or on the species. Regulations are set up by the Confederation, and the execution, well, that's up to cantons. We have a federal organization. That's the way things are in Switzerland, and any measures, administrative measures, are subject to the principle of proportionality, and that means that they need to meet public interests, not just somebody who is bothered by the beaver. So there has to be a public interest, and the measures have to be adapted to a reasonable objective. Any intervention has to be limited. So we start first with prevention, and finally there may be intervention work carried out on the species or the species structures. Now, then there is the ordinance that governs anything that's not covered by the law. And in Article 10, we ask for a national plan for protected species at federal level. Now here, with these colors that we've looked at, we've got the same colors here. So it's important to look at protection, prevention, compensation, and then intervention measures. Now, in the hunting ordinance, there's Article 4 that says that we can intervene on the population from a regulatory point of view when beavers create a lot of damage to infrastructures, and that has an effect on the public interest, or when there is a threat to people. And in Article 10b, it says that the Confederation and the cantons shall jointly pay compensation for damage to crops and forests. 50% is covered by the Confederation, and we're currently drawing up the ordinance for hunting. And as of next year, there will be a focus on damaged infrastructure, so roads that have been damaged. So that kind of damage will be paid for by the Confederation and by the cantons. So there is a plan, and it's to help cantons manage the beaver. So here, this is something that you can find on the internet, and it describes how we're trying to manage the species. Now, so it's the cantons that are responsible for management. It's organized in 3 colors. So in Geneva, they've stopped hunting, but they have professional wildlife wardens who are in charge of management. Then there are cantons that are in light green. So that's places where there is hunting. There are 1 or 2 people who are in charge of management for the whole canton. And for all of the other cantons, there are professional wildlife wardens who are in charge of management. They are the first responders in the field. So the basic principle is as follows. So the beavers colonize any watercourse. If there's no problem, all the better. If there are problems, there are rules that need to be followed in order to manage any conflicts. So to intervene on dams where there are problems, we can take measures focusing on the dams when the public safety is endangered or when the dams potentially lead to considerable damage. For example, crops. We can lower the dams or remove them completely, but we have to have authorization for this. And a cantonal decision has to be taken, and this can and recourse can be made by NGOs in order to solve long-term conflicts in Switzerland. We have to revitalize watercourses. There's a big revitalization project, and we're trying to integrate the beaver as a tool or a partner in these projects. But it's not always very easy. It takes a lot of time, it requires a lot of investment. And then the last solution, shooting or regulation. So this is something that's covered in the law and in the ordinance. But, how are things really in the field? For 10 years, we've had this possibility, but we've never shot at beavers because first of all, you have to take prevention measures. And if no measures work, then you can move on to measures focusing on the species. So we can't focus on the beavers otherwise. So if we have an environment with in red the beavers' territories, and then in the forest with the habitats, and there are problems with where you see the arrows, it's important to remove all of the beavers where there are problems, not here where they're building their wonderful habitat. But the problem is that after a little while, there are young beavers who recolonize and recreate exactly the same problems. So we need long-term solutions to solve these conflicts. And these long-term solutions are always linked to watercourses. The more space we have, the fewer problems we have with beavers. And that can they can help protecting against floods. They retain water if there is a flood. There's less pollution. So the bigger the species, the better networking we have, the better the habitats are, the better the biomass is and biodiversity. But we have to be clear, beavers don't need spaces and watercourses that are revitalized, but we can prevent problems. If the watercourses are not in a natural state, then they will do everything to change them. And that's when the species can create a problem. So just to summarize, in Switzerland, so what we know is that it's especially wetlands and water environments that are threatened in red and in orange. And so it's not surprising that it's the species linked to these habitats that are threatened proportionally speaking. So in Switzerland, we have a biodiversity strategy action plan. The main idea is to have more ecological infrastructures that network protected areas that capitalize on and improve the quality of the surfaces. And this is where beavers play an important role, revitalizing these watercourses. So with the building of dams, they can do this kind of thing. And there's a lot more dead wood, a lot more different habitats in areas where there are beavers. Now, from a landscape point of view, there's a lovely summarized analysis by Summer that goes into details about this from a landscape point of view. So the biodiversity of species is going up thanks to the heterogeneity of the aquatic environment. But as we've already heard, this can endanger certain species that are not mobile. And in Switzerland, we carried out a study on biodiversity. And what we were able to demonstrate is that beaver dams, they increase biodiversity and the abundance of individuals. And been able to demonstrate that even in drainage channels, we've got an we've increased biodiversity 3 times, and in areas like this one shown in the forest where beavers can really flood surface areas, we've got 6 times more species and 6 times more individuals studied. However, to do all of this, you need space, and the beavers need to be able to flood the adjoining species. So Chris Jordan, Annegret Larsen and Chris Jordan have focused on ecosystem effects. So we've organized a model, a global model for beavers and alluvial areas. We model all of the areas that can be flooded in order to anticipate conflict and find surfaces that can encourage biodiversity thanks to beavers. I just want to show you 2 or 3 examples. So here we've got an agricultural area. Here there's a water course. Now our model shows that here with the 2 dams, the 2 beaver dams that are here, the floodable surface in blue, we've got the water course. So if we look at this surface area here where the dot is, this is the dam, and that surface has been flooded. And for France, it might be small, but in Switzerland, it's almost revolutionary to have surface areas like this that can be flooded. So it shows that the model is pretty specific. And in forest areas, we've got the same thing here with this water course. Our model is placed, and we can see the effect of the beavers on the forest, and our model shows the probability of flooding. Now, this model, we've calculated for all of Switzerland. 1% of the Swiss area can be flooded by beavers. So that's 45,000 hectares. And in this model, we've integrated beavers as a part of a program for the protection of nature in Switzerland in order to strengthen biodiversity in forests, in order to create the right conditions for wet forests or floodable forests. So I can say that Switzerland is probably the first country in Europe to actively integrate beavers in a program for protecting nature and not we haven't just limited things to managing damage. And I think that's what we need to do. Where there are problems, they have to be managed. Where they're encouraging biodiversity and ecosystem services, we leave them be. So on the right-hand side, that's the aim. And here, so today we're doing a lot of things with machines. So we've got integrate beavers on water courses. So what can we say about all of this? The beaver is well established in Switzerland and Europe. Biodiversity is generally higher. Water courses shaped by beavers can provide a number of important ecosystem services. And something that's very important, watercourses shaped by beavers are in fact more resilient to various influences and above all to climate change. So we have to let them do what they want to do as far as possible. We have to integrate them into all revitalization projects. We obviously need clear and transparent rules in order to solve problems, but we shouldn't deny shooting or intervention measures because they have to be managed, and sometimes it makes sense to remove the species from certain areas. So we've got to integrate beavers. They are our partners. There you are. We must allow them to build what they want to build. So we're organizing a big conference on the 4th of November in Bern. We'll be presenting the results of a big research project, a national project. And we're going to be bringing out a book in September, The 1,000 Lives of the Beaver. So I finished, and I we'll be delighted to answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much for the light you have shed on the situation in Switzerland. I have a question that comes to mind. So you've done all of the modeling of these floodable areas. I suppose you had LIDAR data in order to do that work? Yes. We created a dam construction model. Then with Annegret and Matthew Davis in Manchester, we built a dam construction model, a hydraulic model with the force of the water course, the width, the slope, all of the different important factors. And then every 50 meters, we placed a dam, either 50 centimeters, that was the average size. During the census in 2022, we found 1,500 dams. So it's 50 centimeters on average. And then we developed a second model with 2 meters 50 dams. And with the LIDAR information, we modeled where the water went. And what I presented to you was the model showing the probability of there being water or not. It doesn't tell us about the depth, it's just probability, the probability of water being there. So this is something that we use a lot for the cantons so that they can anticipate where dams can be built in order to set up forest reserves. So these are reserves for protection for over a 50-year period. And then the owners of the forest receive everything that they lose in terms of wood for the first year, and then they let the forest be managed by beavers. Then the organization creates protected zones thanks to financing with the help of beavers. An additional question when it comes to the modeling. So that model that you've set up, can it be reproducible in other areas, for example, in France? So it looks at the impact on the environment, it looks at the measuring. Yes, in fact, we're publishing the method. It can be applied anywhere. As it's a model that is based just on geographic data, it can be applied anywhere. What we do afterwards, however, is linked to the context, how things work in the specific area. But to know where the floodable areas are, it's something that can be used everywhere. So we're going to make that available to everybody. It's not a miracle. If somebody can use it, then that would be good if other people can use it, because we all want the same thing. We want to encourage biodiversity. So we all have to row in the same direction, basically. Has there been an estimation of costs? How can I put this? Costs that are generated for paying damage. Is that something that's taken into account in the ratio, acting, getting rid of the beaver, or letting it do what it wants to do? How did you take those things into account? We don't really know about damage to infrastructures, but if you take damage to forests and farms and how that was compensated for in the last 50 years, we know exactly what it costs, so between 50 and 100,000 euros every year. So we've got statistics, but for damage to infrastructures, we have no idea. At the moment, it's 1 million that is put aside per year. But after 2 years, we'll see how things go, and maybe we need to adjust things. But all of the projects or the measures that are included in prevention plans or revitalization projects for watercourses, then things cost less. If you're just making sure that beavers don't dig below roads, for example, if you're revitalizing watercourses, you've got all the machines, it costs a lot less. That's when you put in fencing or meshing rather than doing it just to make sure that they don't dig somewhere. So, but it's an open discussion. No, we don't really know where we're going yet. One last question, and then we'll move on to our American speaker concerning consulting populations. The management plan, when was it put to public opinion? Because, of course, there is a concrete impact on agriculture and forests and everything. Sorry, I didn't really understand your question. The management plan that you've set up for Switzerland, was it subjected to public opinion? Was it accepted because it has an economic impact on agriculture and forests, etc.? The plan was developed with all of the partners affected by beavers. That's for sure. Now, for agriculture, the impact of beavers on agriculture, is that what you're asking? Yes, well, for example. So the damage to crops is negligible. So if you've planted fruit trees, for example, you can have quite considerable damage, several thousand Swiss francs, but you know, you need to set up electric fences. When there is a risk of fields being flooded, to prevent damage, we don't wait for the fields to be underwater. We do something beforehand because farmers, you know, they get in contact with the wildlife warden straight away. So we know straight away if there's a new beaver that's been colonizing a watercourse because it's the farmers that contact the wardens. And then we try and anticipate, what's going to happen. And then we introduce measures beforehand, before there is any big damage caused. So even if the farming public says that the beaver is a huge, huge problem, it's not the case. And in relation to fishermen, do they are they opposed to beavers from a fish quantity point of view? That question was in the chat earlier on, I believe. So we carried out a study as part of our national project, our research project. We had a migration module for fishes going via beaver dams, and we studied three different situations that were very different. So water courses that were in size with big dams, or dams that were up to 3 meters. So if fish migrated via the dam, and then we looked at dams in a natural water course with alluvial plains with deviation channels, and then an intermediary situation. We captured all of the fish, we chipped them, we looked at the fish movements, and what we saw was that there's no problem if the water course has a certain dynamic when it comes to floods, because the fish, they migrate during the flooding. Christian Jordan mentioned the same thing last time, in fact. So we know that fish migrate during flooding periods. So in the water course that was incised, about 30% migrate during the drought periods. No fish migrate. It's really during the flooding periods, because that's when the level of water upstream and the level of water downstream of the dam are similar. And so that's how the fish get over. But in a natural situation, and 80% of our fish migrate, and the intermediary situation showed 60%, no, sorry, 50% who were able to migrate. So that's the intermediate situation. So as long as there is some kind of dynamic, a flooding dynamic, there is no problem. And if, the migration is prevented, that can, that's even for altered watercourses, it's not really a problem. Thank you very much, Christof, for taking part, and thank you for your presentation. Please give us the details of your study. And I'm going to introduce Emily Fairfax now. Emily, are you with us?
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you all for having me. I'm going to be talking to you today about a North American perspective on how and why we are bringing beavers back. So when we think about beavers, especially over here in North America, a lot of times what we're thinking about is climate change. Our climate is changing incredibly quickly. We are seeing more and more natural disasters. Our forests are going up in smoke. Our reservoirs are running drier every single year, and the scale and intensity of floods that we see are increasingly damaging and difficult to deal with. And so clearly, we need to be building more climate resilient landscapes. We are very vulnerable to the changes that are happening, but we can build our way out of this. However, it does take a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of hands working on this to actually make a change that's on the scale of these forest fires, of these droughts, of these floods. But luckily, we're not the only engineers working on this problem. We also work a lot with nature's engineers. And if you had asked me 15 years ago if people would be really seriously working with beavers to deal with climate change, I would have said, no, that's silly. Like, of course not. Why would they do that? But just in the recent years, this has become a very serious effort throughout North America. We see states and cities and counties all investing their time and their money and their resources in supporting nature's engineers so that we can have a chance of getting a more resilient landscape as climate continues to change. So beavers and climate change are not words that people usually use in a sentence together, but I'm going to walk you through some of the key ways that beavers are helping us with climate change, and then talk about how we've worked strategically to bring beavers back and keep them in the places we want them so that we can get these climate change benefits. So when we think about why beavers have anything to do with climate change, what it really comes down to is that beavers build complexity in the rivers. They build complexity in our lakes, they build complexity in our ponds, and it's through that complexity that they are making these different places resilient to hydrologic extremes. They're resilient to drought, they're resilient to flood, they're resilient to fire. And it's all because it's physically a complex part of the landscape. On your left here, you have a drawing of a stream that does not have beavers on it. And this is what many of our streams look like around the world now. Globally, depending on where you're at, we've lost between 30 and 90% of our wetland area, and that includes streamside and riverside wetlands. So this is what we have. This is not what most of our rivers used to be. It does not support a particularly large or healthy ecosystem, and it's little more than just a conveyor belt for water. But when you have beavers move in, they're going to build a dam. And these beaver dams, they are more than just the dam structure themselves. They create a large ponded area. The beavers are going to be digging canals that radiate outwards from their ponds across the rest of the valley bottom. They connect upstream to downstream. A lot of folks think that the canals just go outwards, but they also are building that connection between the upper and lower portions of your stream and your river. And it's incredibly physically complex. There are a lot of pathways for your water, for your sediment, for your nutrients to all take here. And the end result of all of this building of complexity is a very large wetland patch. Now, when we think about the challenges of climate change, the main concerns are flood, drought, and fire. And when it comes to beaver wetlands, these are all linked together. So when we have a flood, if there is not enough wetland area along the river, those flood waves have too much power and too little space. And what we see happening over and over again is that they simply rip through the river corridor and they pull apart the banks and they cause a lot of erosion and they make it even more incised, even more degraded, even more unhealthy. However, when those flood waves hit a wetland, especially a beaver wetland, there are so many more places for the water to go. It's going to be deeper water, it's going to be wider water, It's going to have all these little canals that are flowing that water out across the valley bottom, across the floodplain where the water belongs. And it's still the same amount of water moving through, but it gets spread out, it gets delayed. And when it does ultimately go downstream, it has less power to it. And so when we don't have these beavers restoring our rivers for us, we see a very large amount of erosion and soil loss and scouring. When we do have beavers, though, what we see is that water is being spread out and slowed down and stored. Now, this is temporary storage. This is not like they're storing it for 10 years or 100 years or 1,000 years. They're not building the huge concrete dams that we as people are famous for building. They're building leaky structures that water does still trickle through. It's coming over the dam, around the dam, under the dam. It is flowing through the soil, through the groundwater system. It's just taking its time. And now if you think about those two systems, but instead of looking at it from above, looking at it with depth, in our stream without beavers, we have the plants along the top. The stream itself is pretty narrow. It does not have a very large impact on the groundwater or the soil water system. In our stream with beavers, the pond is much wider on the top. You have all of those canals the beavers have dug that look like little micro streams. And in both of these drawings, I have set the water table pretty deep. This is true even if our water table is not as deep or if we have a drought and the water table drops. But as long as you have infiltrating precipitation, as long as you have rain or snow that's seeping into your soil, it doesn't really matter from the vegetation's perspective if there's a beaver wetland there or not. All of the plants are healthy, the ecosystem is intact, it's doing fine. But more often than not, we are not in these consistent wet periods. We're not in a time or a place where there's always abundant water anymore. We are more often than not finding ourselves with increasing numbers and frequencies of drought. And as soon as we have a drought, we lose that rainfall or snow melt on the top. All the plants that cannot reach groundwater are going to start to wilt and wither and shut down for the season. They dry out. In our stream without beavers, that's a lot of vegetation, especially if we had had a wet winter or a wet spring and then it dries out in summer. That's a lot of biomass that is now drying out and turning into fuel. However, in our stream with beavers, because they have such stronger connection to the soil, to the groundwater system, through this broad pond, through all of these beaver canals, the earth is basically like a huge sponge that's filled up with water. And there's enough stored there that the plants can keep accessing it through their roots, even if it hasn't rained or snowed in a long time. And this matters a lot, especially for us in North America, but also for folks in Europe, increasingly so, when you have a wildfire. So when wildfire burns through the landscape, it is going to burn whatever is driest and easiest to burn. And in many cases, that has been our river bottoms, that has been the forests, that has been our natural areas. They are drought stressed and it is very easy to burn them. And that's not what we want to see, especially at the scale that we're seeing it now. A lot of places have a natural fire regime where they should have some amount of fire burning, but most natural fire regimes do not include having your whole river corridor burn every single time there's a fire. But that's what happens unless we have beavers. When we have beavers in there, because that area never gets drought stressed, it's also too green and too wet to burn. And this isn't just a conceptual model or a drawing that we've made. This has been the core of what I've been studying for the last 10 years. And this is what we see over and over and over again. We see our forests get burnt all the way to the tips of the trees. We see the soil burn. We see massive habitat loss. We see an incredible amount of sediment and metals and pollution getting into the waterways, except where there's beavers building their dams. When we have our beaver wetlands along the river corridor, what we see instead is that they stay green, they stay healthy, they stay intact. The water is clear, it's cool. There are fish in there, there's frogs in there, there's turtles. We've seen bobcats, bears, beavers, all sorts of birds. Many, many animals know instinctually that when there is no water on the land and when there is a fire, they need to find somewhere wet to go. We see animals that are collared with GPS tags seek out wet meadows during fire, and they can't always find them. But if there's enough beavers in the land, then they don't have to travel that far to find one of these patches, to hunker down, and to be safe during the wildfire. And one thing that we've looked at specifically is what else are the beavers helping with? And how is this different than when our streams don't have beavers in them? So me and Chris Jordan put together this figure that shows two different scenarios we could find ourselves in. In both scenarios, the global temperature is increasing. It's getting hotter. We're facing a lot of challenges with that. When we don't have beaver-based structures, whether that's beaver dams, beaver canals, beaver mimicry things like BDAs, we see surface water temperature increase, which leads to poor habitat. We see disturbance intensities increasing, which is going to have more powerful peak flows. We see our precipitation shift, and we have more rain instead of snow, so we have more flooding. And all of those things then make it so that the riverscape gets more degraded. When it floods over and over and over again, that scours it out and makes it more vulnerable to future floods. When you have less habitat and less vegetation, that makes it more likely that we're going to see increased erosion, that we're going to lose species, that we're not going to be able to store as much carbon. But in the alternate scenario, where you get beavers in there and they're working on the streams, we still see global temperature increasing, causing temperatures to rise. But those beaver dams push water into the groundwater system where it cools down, where it's shaded, and where you don't get such a strong increase. And so it doesn't get too hot for fish. It doesn't get too hot and have a big algal bloom. It stays cold. When you have your droughts and floods and fires becoming more frequent and more powerful, instead of that sort of degrading and ripping apart your river, you see these beaver dams attenuate those peak floods and store water in the soil and keep it protected during drought. And so you maintain high quality habitat mosaics, you maintain your disturbance resilience. And when we see our precipitation shift, when we get more rain and less snow, instead of that just turning into these flows that are higher earlier and earlier in the year and less water in the summer, what we see is that these beaver-based structures can slow it down, keep it on the landscape, and let it go downstream still, but later in the season and with less power to it. And so in one scenario where we do not have our beavers back, we see our riverscapes get increasingly unhealthy, increasingly degraded over time. And in the other scenario where we do have beavers, we see them get increasingly resilient. So it's not that we need to, continue to meddle in the rivers ourselves and keep messing with things and keep changing things. All we need to do is get the beavers back, and then they know what to do. Because beavers in both North America and Eurasia have been building their dams for 7.5 million years. They have a long history of shaping these continents. We just have to let them do it. They are the experts. We have not been engineering for as long as they have. And all that engineering is quite valuable. So there have been some studies that have tried to quantify exactly how valuable beavers are, not as fur, but instead as a force of climate adaptation and other things. And what we found overall is that you could estimate that for every square kilometer that beavers are engineering, they're providing about 60,000 euros of ecosystem services per year, per square kilometer. And that comes in the form of moderating extreme events, so droughts, floods, fires. It comes in the form of water supply. It comes from recreational hunting and fishing. We've seen incredible support for beaver-based restoration here in the States when we see people who like to fish or who like to hunt go out and they find tons and tons of ducks or tons and tons of trout, always in the beaver ponds, because it's such good habitat for them. We see it come in habitat and biodiversity provisioning. There are a lot of species, plant and animal alike, that have a lot of value to us, whether that's cultural or economic, and they find their homes in beaver habitats. And then finally, we find it through greenhouse gas sequestration. A lot of the things that I've talked about would fall under the umbrella of climate adaptation, so figuring out how to deal with the challenges of climate change that have already happened. But beavers are also helpful with climate mitigation, so pulling those greenhouse gases, that carbon dioxide, out of the atmosphere and sequestering it in the soil and in dead wood underneath the ground. They're outstanding at that. And they provide all this value to us. And a lot of times when we think about beavers, when we talk about money, we talk about how much their damages cost, which is understandable. We need to know those numbers too. But just like with any system, you want to know the pros and the cons of it. So when we think about beavers, yes, maybe we are spending, $10,000 or 10,000 euros per year to keep them from flooding our roads or doing whatever, but that's less than the 60,000 per square kilometer per year that they're giving back to us. And so thinking about them as both a force of economic gain and as something we have to spend money on is definitely a lesson we've learned over here to make sure that we're making the right choices and not costing ourselves more in the long run. So you might be thinking, how do you actually get those benefits? Europe is doing a great job of bringing beavers back overall. However, I will say that we have a lot more beavers than you guys do, so we've learned a lot of things along the way. And it can be challenging that you want to bring beavers back. And in some places, that's very easy because you have beavers nearby. But in other places, it's very challenging because there are no beavers nearby. And you know this watershed used to have beavers, but it hasn't had a beaver for 500 years. So how do you get them back? How do you make them stay? And how do you live with them once they're there? So when I think about getting beavers back, it really comes down to building good beaver habitat and then coexisting with them when they arrive. Don't invite them back to a landscape and then get all mad and kick them back out as soon as they're there because they chewed on a tree. Of course, they're going to chew on a tree. That's what they've evolved to do. So with beaver mimicry, which is encouraging beavers, one of the things that we like to do is build beaver dam analogs. Now, when we build a beaver dam analog, the whole goal is to mimic the process that beavers go through naturally when they dam up streams. So in this little drawing here, you see a couple of beaver dams in a pretty incised stream. Water's flowing over them. It's, very much in a trench. Beavers do the best they can. Over time, naturally, beavers are going to come and go from a site. They don't stay in the same place forever. And when they leave, their dams start to break down a little bit. The stream starts to move around a little bit more. It carves out its channel a little bit wider. And then the process repeats. The beavers come back, they build again, their dams are a little bit bigger this time, and then they leave and it starts to carve away again and it gets a little bit wider again. And the whole time you're building up sediment, you're adding wood to the soil, you are slowing the water down, you're keeping it on the landscape, the water table is slowly rising. And then it happens again and again and again. And so in this natural cycle of beaver engineering, we see the beavers are persistent and they're consistent, but they're not necessarily on site at a specific place working 24/7, 365. They come and they go, and it's through that dynamics of being there and then leaving and then being there and then leaving that you really get all of these restoration benefits coming as fast and efficiently as possible. And that's what we do with BDAs, or that's what we try to do with BDAs. BDA being a beaver dam analog or fake beaver dam that we've built. And so we build these things, we have to let them fail. I think one of the biggest lessons we've learned over here is when folks build BDAs, sometimes we try too hard to, do it better than the beavers, even though they've been engineering this many, many, many years longer than us. And we're like, oh, we'll make it stay longer. Like, yeah, beaver dam, it's going to be, blowing out every 10 years, every 20 years. Let's post this in as far as we can. Let's get metal in there. Let's make this thing last 50 years. And that's not the goal. You want your structures to be dynamic, just like the beaver dams are dynamic. And so huge lesson learned here is let the BDAs fail. Let them blow out, let them break, let them move. And if you do that, then you can actually start to recreate that process cycle that beavers do that builds up your stream and restores that wetland ecosystem quickly. We've tried building real dams before with concrete and it didn't do this. And so we need to really focus on what makes beaver dams so effective at this and truly mimic it. Even if our own people instincts say, I could do this better, it's a time to be humble and actually do what the beavers do. And so I really like this drawing as well of the process going from a pretty unhealthy stream where BDAs have been added all the way out to the end goal of it being highly restored. And what I like about this one is that it does highlight that when beavers come, it all goes faster and it's much better. And that beavers do like to come visit BDAs and they like to take over BDAs. We have seen many cases where we'll build some beaver dam analogs in places that we're pretty sure are the best places to put a beaver dam analog. It's geomorphically, it's perfect. Hydrologically, we're going to get the most benefit. And then beavers show up and they rip apart our BDA and they build themselves a new beaver dam that's maybe, 5 meters away. And so they don't agree with us about where these things go sometimes. Sometimes they will take our materials and build elsewhere. Sometimes they will take over the BDA directly and we get an A+ from them and they're like, yeah, this is a good spot. I've also seen one case where they built their own dam, literally less than a meter next to the dam that we had put in. And so whatever decision we had made was just enough wrong that they were not going to take advantage of it. They were going to do their own thing still. But all that's to say is that we still don't know exactly how they make their decisions about where they put their structures. We're still learning that. And when beavers show up, they correct us, but they also do it better than us. And there's no way around that. Beavers are better at river restoration than we are. Beavers are better at building these little dams than we are. And when you put in BDAs, you should expect them to show up, and you should expect them to do work, and you should expect them to disagree with what you've done so far. And it's not a waste of your time or your money if they don't like the structures you built or if they change them. That's part of the goal. You want it to be a dynamic system. And if you're wondering how do you actually do these things, the two guides that I often point people to that we use very heavily across the country here are the Beaver Restoration Guidebook and then the Low-Tech Process-Based Restoration Guidebook. These are sort of two ends of the spectrum. The Beaver Restoration Guidebook is all about when you actually have the beavers there, how do you live with them? How do you work with them? What are they doing? Why are they doing it? And then the Low-Tech Process-Based Restoration book, that one's more about, okay, you have an unhealthy stream. How do you act like a beaver, try to fix it? And how do you maximize the chances that a beaver will want to come back? Because the more and more it starts to look like something the beavers would like, the more likely you are to actually get beavers coming back on their own. And that's the highest chance you have of them staying, is when they come back on their own. So some questions that I always get when I talk to folks about beavers and working with beavers for climate change and really turning back a lot of control to them, especially when it comes to working in our rivers. I get questions like, what about warm water? There's a lot of species in the aquatic landscape that are very temperature sensitive. And fish especially can be very, very sensitive to temperature. If it's 1 degree too warm, they just die. And that's not something we want to have happen. But there's a lot of research coming out more and more every single year showing that when you have beavers move in, you get colder water. And that is for a variety of reasons. And some of it depends on which specific environmental context you're in. But generally, you get that colder water because the dam pushes surface water into the ground. And when it's in the ground, it is protected from the sun. It is not getting any heat from the sun added to it. And it's mixing with water that has been out of the sun, that has been cold and underground for a long time. And it doesn't just stay down there though. When you have a dam blocking flow and water comes and hits it, the water gets pushed down, but then immediately downstream of your dam, or maybe sometimes as far as 1 kilometer or 2 downstream of your dam, the water does come back and rejoin your river or rejoin your stream. So you get this net cooling effect when beavers move in, which is counterintuitive when you think about the fact that beavers are also chewing down a lot of trees. They're removing the shade from many parts of your river, but it's still colder water because of the way they engage the groundwater system. Another question I get a lot is, what about diseases? I don't know if this persists over in Europe with you guys, but a lot of folks here know the term beaver fever to refer to Giardia, which is a very unpleasant illness that you can get. This originated being called beaver fever because a bunch of hikers in Canada drank water out of the bottom of a beaver pond, and they all got Giardia and they all got very sick, and they blamed the beavers for it, and so they called it beaver fever. And there's a couple of things off about this story, and the first is that you just shouldn't drink water from the bottom of a pond anywhere, because all the gross things live in the sediment that you don't want to ingest. So that was a mistake, number one. Beavers are not. Number two was that after, like, this was in the 1980s, and now 25 years later, somebody finally went back and actually looked at the samples of Giardia and tried to better understand what happened there. And what they found was that those beavers in Canada, but also beavers across North America, are actually much more likely to be infected by people and dogs and cattle than they are to actually be the source of Giardia. They can get sick with the same Giardia that people can. And so if there are people putting Giardia into the water, either with our dogs, ourselves, or our livestock, it can get beavers sick. And then if you go drink water from a sick beaver's pond, you will probably get sick too. But the Giardia was already in the water. They are not the source of it. They are just something that is manifesting it along the way and getting sick with it along the way. And so I would say, like, yes, you can get Giardia from beaver ponds, but you can get Giardia from any body of water. And this is true for a lot of other kinds of diseases that people worry about, invasive species that people worry about. Beavers are not these uniquely disease-ridden animals. They're actually quite clean when it comes to a lot of diseases that we see. Very, very few beavers over here get rabies, for example, whereas tons of raccoons and skunks and other things have rabies. We don't see them carrying the zebra mussels or other invasive species around between bodies of water. Overall, they are pretty benign in that regard. I also get asked about fish passage a lot, and I'm sure that Chris talked about this in his webinar at least a little bit, but fish can get around beaver dams. Fish have also lived in our continents for 7.5 million years, as have beavers, and people were not helping fish get past beaver dams 7 million years ago. We were not that advanced yet. Beavers have taken care of this on their own, and fish have figured it out on their own. With a beaver dam that is new, they are very leaky. And the holes in these dams, especially down near the base of the dam, can be like this big. Like fish can swim through these. We see fish swim through beaver dams all the time. We also have an incredible amount of connectivity through those canals. And it's important to note here, and this was a big lesson we've learned, is that beavers don't always build their canals immediately. Sometimes you have to wait until they've been there for a year or two, and then they have time to build their canals. And those canals will connect upstream to downstream. Those canals are pathways for the beavers, they're pathways for the fish, they're pathways for frogs, for turtles, for everything else, but it takes them a little bit of time to build them. So if you're expecting perfect fish passage in the very first year of construction, you might have a little bit more difficulty there. If you give your beavers a couple of years to get settled, you should have very good fish passage, except in the most profound periods of drought, in which case you have a different function of the beaver wetland, which is a hydrologic refuge. So it is water, the deep pools stay wet, they stay cold enough and big enough to hold fish, even when the rest of the stream dries up. And we see this, especially in California, a lot, where our streams run out of water and there's just pockets, like little ponds along the way. And those are the beaver ponds, and that's where all the fish wait until the rain comes back and they can move again. So those are ways to bring them back. And those are all the concerns that, not all the concerns, I'm sure. Those are a lot of the concerns that folks have when we talk about bringing back beavers. Understandable, we're asking folks to give up a lot of control and to trust a like 35 kilogram rodent with that. But it is worth it. But that's not to say that once they come back, we just have to let them do anything that they want and that we don't get a say in any of it anymore. People and beavers are engineers. So tree chewing, really common problem folks have with beavers. If you're doing any kind of restoration work that you think might attract a beaver to your site, you should have many rolls of this fence on hand if you want to protect your trees. And you don't have to protect your trees. You can let the beavers chew them. They would love that. But if there are trees that you care about, trees that have sentimental value, trees that are providing shade over a park, you just have to wrap them in heavy wire fencing. And I want to be especially clear on this. The fencing does need to be tall enough that your beavers cannot just rear up on their hind legs, put their paws on and squish it down. Beavers are heavy, beavers are strong. We see most of our failures come from too short a fence or from too close of a fence wrap. So on that picture on the right, you can see the beavers were still able to chew on the tree. Makes sense. They wrapped the tree so close, it didn't actually do anything. The beaver just stuck its little face in and chewed anyways. There's also been a lot more research coming out and a lot more experiments done with electric fencing. And I've found that this is a really good option when you cannot wrap all of your trees. Maybe you're trying to protect a forest, like a whole forest. Maybe you're trying to stop them from going in a specific direction. Beavers don't like being shocked. Surprising, I know. And if you put up electric fencing, they pretty quickly learn not to go that direction. And one of the really big advantages of beavers is that they live a long time compared to other rodents. In the wild, beavers can live 10 to 12 years on average, but it's not unheard of or even uncommon to see beavers get up to be 15, 16, even 20 years old. So they learn to not go get shocked, and then they hold that knowledge their whole life. And because beavers are a social species, they can share knowledge with their kits, with their young, and you can ultimately somewhat train the beavers to not go places where they're not able to get food resources. They will learn that pathway does not lead to anything I want. They stop going that way. There's a lot of ways to protect culverts. This is a big issue in the United States. We have lots of these pipes that go under roads and things that are too small and that beavers love to dam. And it's just not that complicated of engineering. Put up a fence that they can't dam on. and you've protected your culvert. I think another big lesson that we've learned is you actually don't have to be that creative to stop a beaver. They're very good engineers, but they're not necessarily as good as we are. And all you have to do is try something, see if it works. And if it works, just leave it. The beavers will adapt by going somewhere else and trying something else themselves. Pond levelers have also been incredibly important, especially in wetter climates. So you have a pipe that basically goes through the beaver dam, and then you weigh down both sides, and it drains a little bit of water off of your pond. These are not to drain the whole pond. They're to just take it down enough so that it doesn't flood a road or a house or something like that that you really don't want underwater. There's all sorts of design schemes that you can look up online about how to build these, but I want to make a point here that this is one of the more active areas of research for us is, can we make these better? Can we make them less ugly? Can we make them function better? Can we make them last longer? Can we make them need less maintenance? I would say that we have made huge strides with getting these things installed and having good case studies of them working, but there's always room for improvement. And they are big. So these are the kinds of things you do need a crew to work on. Another big lesson that we've learned is getting folks trained earlier. We work with a lot of high school students and college students to make sure that they know how to build and install one of these, so that if they go get a job with the Park Service or the Forest Service, they already know how to do this and take care of it. And you can get a lot more beavers on the landscape if people are ready to coexist with them immediately, and it doesn't become this huge process of trying to find someone who can do this, and at that point everyone's already mad at the beaver and it's easier to kill them. We want to not get to that point. Another thing we've just started piloting over here is notch exclusions. So instead of putting a pipe through the dam, you basically break a small part of the dam and then fence it off so the beavers can't dam it anymore. This has shown a lot of promise, especially in mountains in Washington and Oregon. The challenge with it is that you do have to maintain it a lot more. So if you have a high flow event like a flood, it's a pretty good chance this is going to get beaten up and you'd have to go fix it. But especially during drier seasons, these can do a really good job of letting water flow out without having that whole big pipe going through your dam. We do still remove a lot of beavers. In North America, we have somewhere between 25 and probably 40,000 beavers killed every single year for conflict, which is way too many. We have also started moving beavers, relocating them in many places. This is incredibly useful when we have watersheds where beavers are not currently in, and they should be there. They were there before the fur trade. And it's hard for our resident beavers to find their way back. Either they have to go over a big highway or they're trying to bypass one of our big dams. We like to relocate them for that. Relocation is hard. You have to move the whole family if you want it to be successful. Beavers are very sensitive. They do have quite a few predators, and this isn't just in North America. The adults are pretty safe. No matter where you are, they're huge. But the babies are not. Babies are like that big. And they get eaten by birds, they get eaten by otters, they get eaten by bobcats and smaller things, foxes. So they do have quite a few predators when they're young. So you want to make sure wherever you take that family, if there are babies or if there are going to be babies soon, it has enough shelter for them to actually be safe. You don't want to bring them there and then have them all get eaten by baby, or all the babies get eaten by otters. You want that beaver family to thrive if you're going to put in the effort to actually move them. And then we still take out beaver dams as well. This is challenging for a lot of reasons. One is that the beavers are just going to build it again right away. Even if you also remove the beavers, new beavers are going to show up and build a new dam. We've seen a lot of data suggesting that once beavers decide a site is good for damming, you will have beavers there forever until it's not a good site for damming. And to make it not a good site for damming is to make it an unhealthy river again. So once your river's healthy, beavers are going to keep showing up year after year. They're going to keep building dams. When you remove these dams, you release a lot of water and sediment all at once. You're basically simulating a huge flood. You're also setting back all of the benefits that the beavers have created to square one. And so you're constantly pushing them back to the beginning, back to the beginning. You don't get some of those later benefits that only happen if the beavers have been established a while. So that was a lot to think about. Lots of lessons learned, lots of areas of research that we're still working on. We have the luxury in some parts of the United States to be able to be experimental. We have very healthy beaver populations, for example, in Minnesota and Wisconsin. where if we try a new design of a pond leveler and it doesn't work and those beavers have to be killed, it does not push our beavers to extinction. We don't have that luxury everywhere. Places like California, if we mismanage beavers, we could lose them from a whole watershed in an instant. So when you think about all of these things, you think about these benefits, you think about the choices you want to make to bring them back. You also have to think about how much risk can you actually take? How sensitive and vulnerable are your beavers? Are you in a place to be piloting new things, or are you in a place where you just need to do everything as, best known as possible because you only have 40 beavers in the whole watershed, and if you have one huge storm, you could lose them all. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have about that. There's so much more I could talk about. I could talk about beavers all day, but I want to make sure that I have time to actually answer any things that you guys are wondering about in particular. So thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Émilie, pour cette présentation. On va pouvoir passer aux questions, donc n'hésitez pas à réagir dans...
Thanks a lot, Emily, for this presentation. There was a question about mimetic a dam. So isn't there a risk? So if there were some studies whereby we could do away with beavers to do that, isn't there a risk?
Yeah, so I don't think there's really a risk with building our beaver mimicry structures. We can't do it as well as beavers can, and we can't get all the benefits that beavers can. Even if we get better and better at building these things, one of the things that makes actual beavers and actual beaver wetlands so uniquely strong is that the beavers are there on site 24/7 working. They have built-in maintenance staff. So even if you have somebody, a person coming to check your beaver dam analogs every week, you're still only working 1/7 as hard as the beavers are. And that's a lot of value because we don't want to go out there every single day and pack some mud on and go chew on a tree. We have better ways to use our time, especially with climate change. So I would say no. I think there is a perception that we can replace beavers and that's something we got to talk about a lot, but we can't.
Merci pour cette réponse.
Thanks a lot for this answer.
Oui, il y avait une question tout à l'heure qui nous était venue sur la différence effectivement entre les espèces.
The difference between European beavers and American beavers. Is there a difference in terms of behaviors between the two species? The European species, the American species, do they build more dams than the European beavers?
So the North American and Eurasian beaver are functionally identical. So they do all the same things. The biggest difference is that North American beaver is 5% larger on average. So for example, when you have both of them living next to each other, which I believe has happened in Norway, because of how relocations and reintroduction happened before our understanding of those two different species, they don't interbreed, and the North American beaver is slightly better at living in cold climates than the Eurasian beaver that's left over, at least. It's possible that you have lost the strain of Eurasian beavers that thrived in the far north. But they do all the same things. They build the same number of dams. I think in Europe, there is a perception that they maybe build less dams and they build more bank burrows and things like that. But we have those same perceptions in parts of the United States where it's just not great habitat for them to build dams in. Either the river is flowing too strong, or there's a lot of things messing with their dams, like people and dogs, or cities, or there's not good building material. And then they'll just den into the bank. It's not as good for them. We see them even when they live in big lakes, both in Europe and North America, they would prefer to dam the inlet and outlet. Even if they have a whole lake to use, they're still I could dam this though, but not the whole thing, just a little bit. They're very driven to do this, both species.
Alors, il y a une autre question sur est-ce qu'il y a des programmes de
There's another question. Reintroduction programs in California or elsewhere in the United States. How do you choose to reintroduce beavers somewhere? What is the plan?
Yeah, so there are beaver reintroductions happening all over the United States. California, Colorado, Oregon, Wyoming, Idaho, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona. I could list all the states. It's probably not helpful. They're happening everywhere. They're also happening in the East Coast in some places. They're happening in the Midwest. They're happening in our big farm belts. We've just really realized that we need help, and beavers are there to help us. So in terms of how we decide where they go and when we do this, in terms of like state by state, usually it's for climate benefit. That's what tips the scales. That's what we need the most help with. In terms of the specific locations we put them, there's a number of scorecards that we use that let us know, like, how likely is it that this beaver is going to stay? That's usually one of our goals, is we find a spot we really want the beaver to be in because it's degraded or it's right next to a sensitive species that would benefit from more wetland habitat. And then we try to make them stay. And that's the hardest part. We put them where we want them, but sometimes the beaver's like, not happening. And it'll hoof it and it'll go like 150 kilometers away. It'll just leave. And that's like, great, glad we did this. One of my colleagues has placed a beaver in a tributary, and that beaver immediately left and swam 80 miles back to its home location. And so basically they just gave it a weekend trip to a new part of the watershed, and the beaver decided no. But pretty much when we do relocation, we get them into our public lands first, or on private landowner properties where they personally want the beavers. We know that forcing people to have beavers is not usually successful, but giving people who want beavers the beavers sets this precedent of, if you want them, you can have them. And then you see all the benefits they bring, and that makes their neighbors want them too. And you get this sort of cascading effect of people wanting them back.
Merci pour cette réponse. Une autre question du coup qui...
Thanks a lot. Compensation in case of damage and the legal status of the beaver legal protection. I mean, is it centralized? I mean, does the law depend on the different legislations in the state?
Yeah. So in terms of compensation and legal status, it
En ce qui
varies
concerne les compensations et le statut
state by
juridique,
state.
cela varie d'un État à l'autre.
And what we've seen is in some places there is funding
Dans
available to stop
certains endroits,
beavers from
il y a
causing
des financements
too much damage, so
pour
it pays for those
empêcher les
coexistence structures.
castors de faire des dégâts, en fait.
In other places, there's
Et
some amount
dans
of
d'autres
payment for
endroits,
lost crops, but it's not
il y a
super
des
common.
compensations lorsque vous avez perdu des récoltes.
In terms of their legal status, they are protected in California and not really protected anywhere else. Some places have a shorter trapping season, some places have a longer trapping season, but we have not been successful in getting any nationwide protection policies in place. It is a goal. More places are moving towards that, but it's challenging for a lot of reasons, I'm sure you know.
Et donc du coup, comment vous gérez les réintroductions en sachant
So
que derrière...
how do you manage reintroductions given that the beavers are not protected, so potentially they can be hunted?
Yeah, we keep locations secret in places where we know that there is a threat to them. The culture around beavers also varies a lot from state to state. So in Colorado, for example, a lot of people want the beavers back, and we don't really worry about them being trapped out. It's like there's a very short trapping window. The places that we put them, it's very hard to get to. In Oregon, we keep them very secret because there's a lot of tension there, and there have been individuals that will follow the scientists who are studying this and figure out where they're putting beavers and kill their beavers. Like, it's ridiculous. So we sort of listen to the tone of the place we're putting them, and then try to keep them as protected as we can. Some places have been experimenting with temporary trapping bans and not allowing trapping right after the relocation, or putting them in a place where timing it so that it's already going to be a no trapping season. Recreational trapping is not that big of a concern. We have some of it, but that's not what's killing our beavers. It's the conflict trapping. And usually the same agencies that are managing conflict trapping are also managing the relocations. So they can choose to not issue permits to do a lethal removal in a place that they've been trying to reestablish beaver.
Merci. Une autre question du coup
Thank you.
sur
Another question about the choice of setting up BDAs or not. How do you go about this? Is it in terms of opportunities, when it's easy to do, or, you know, are there other criteria that you need to look at? Do you have to do in-depth studies, for example?
Yeah, you don't have to do in-depth studies to place BDAs in some places. Like we know we've scraped pretty much every piece of wood out of most of our rivers, and there's very few rivers in the country that would not benefit from having a little bit more dead wood in them. So that's pretty safe. More often we have to worry about if we have landowner buy-in, if everybody understands what the BDA does and does not do, if there are any issues with access to the sites, if it's private land versus public land. But some of the installs that we do over here, it's like 300-400 structures at once. And we get a meadow that we know needs a lot of restoration. We apply for permits. During that permit process, they ask us, like, what do you expect to happen? How long do you think these structures are going to be there? What's the plan if they blow out or whatever? Then the permit gets issued, and then a crew goes in and works a lot to get all these beaver dams in, and we see what happens. And we generally are putting the BDAs in places that we want beavers back and that we think beavers could be very successful in, because we do know that BDAs can be an attractant for beavers. So we don't want to be putting them, say, in like a downtown city center, because that'll draw beavers to that place. And we also know that's where we tend to have a lot more conflict. So we put it on open space, we put it where we want beavers. We tend to put it on rivers and meadows that are unhealthy. They can have benefits in healthy rivers too, but they have bigger benefits in those unhealthy rivers.
Merci. Il y avait une question notamment
There
pour
was
rebondir
another question relating to what Christof was saying, where a beaver plan was adopted. Do you have the same thing in the United States? I know that you wrote an article proposing a beaver plan for North America. Is it something that resonates politically? Is something that might be taken up?
Yeah, we definitely pitched for that nationwide beaver plan and have yet to get it. But we do have a lot of statewide beaver management plans, and I've helped write some of these, and I've consulted on a lot of them, especially for the drought and the fire issues. And the tone of these plans has changed a lot in the last 5 to 10 years. Our beaver management plans used to be all about conflict and like how many beavers can we destroy every year without harming the population? How many dams can we destroy? Can you use dynamite or explosives or not? Some places you still can. We're working on it. But now the beaver management plans tend to be, here's all the reasons we want the beavers. Like, let's start off the conversation right. They are good. We want them here. But there are challenges. So what do we do about those challenges? And how do we get the beavers in the places we want them, live with them in the places we're kind of like, okay, and then deal with them in places where it's really, really challenging to have them. And so I do see a lot of political momentum supporting this lately. We've had a lot of politicians, governors show up to beaver relocations and like give their pitch about why this is a good thing and they're helping with climate change. So I think we are seeing our political figures try to build on the momentum that beavers have and support them, because it makes a lot of sense. It's very low cost. It's very high reward. Beavers are charismatic. People like them generally. And so I anticipate, if I had to guess, I would say that in 10 years, we will see much more unified beaver plans that are very climate change focused. I think we're just still figuring out how to get all the pieces to fit together right now.
Merci. Il y avait une autre
Thank you very
question.
much. There was another question about the size of watercourses where beavers can be active, and the size of watercourses where you can put, I think he said BDAs in.
Yeah, so Those are two different sizes. So for beavers, they can be on our biggest rivers. They are on the main stem of the Mississippi River, huge, huge, huge river. They live in the Colorado River where there's rapids, big rapids. When they're on these really big rivers, what we see them do instead of damming those big rivers, because they can't, they're not building big Hoover dams, they will burrow into the banks, but they'll also dam in the floodplain. So they don't dam the main stem. They'll put in dams that are only going to be holding water during the lowest water period. Our big rivers tend to have more up and down states. They'll have high water and low water. It's very different levels. And beavers need to deal with that. So they have their dams up for the high water in the floodplain, and then they have bank dens that they live in during low water. When I've gone whitewater rafting down some of the big rivers in the American West, every stick you pull out of the water is beaver chewed. Like, they love those systems, even though it's very fast water, very hard for us to imagine swimming in. They can do it. They just aren't going to dam it. They're going to dig their canals. They're going to chew trees. They're going to do all the other engineering behaviors, but they don't dam the main stem. So with that information, we don't put BDAs across the Mississippi River. That's way too big for that. We do absolutely put BDAs in its tributaries and the smaller streams that run into it. One of the things that we're starting to see come out of the research is that beavers and beaver dam analogs have the largest net effect the further up they are in the watershed. So a beaver at your headwaters in your mountains, that beaver is going to be doing a lot more work for the system than a beaver that's living on the main stem. The beaver on the main stem is still doing important things, but they don't affect as much downstream area because they're already farther downstream. The more places that are downstream of your beavers or your beaver dam analogs, the more long-term and pronounced effect you'll get.
Merci. Il y avait une question voilà, sur
Thank you very
l'opportunité.
much. There was a question on the opportunity of beaver mimicry, given that you've got a whole range of solutions linked to dead wood, low-tech solutions. When do you decide to do beaver mimicry rather than something else? A low-tech solution with dead wood, for example?
We make those decisions based on two real things. The first is, do we want beavers back in that specific place? If we do not want them there, we do not build BDAs. That is a recipe for disaster. The other thing we ask is this a system that a beaver could theoretically dam in its current state? And sometimes it's so degraded, the answer is no. And if the answer is no, sometimes it's more effective to put in like a PAL, which is a post-assisted log structure. These are like BDAs, but they only go halfway across, and that will push water at the bank and really cause fast widening and erosion. And so sometimes we start with those and then go to BDAs and then go to something else. In really big rivers, we're going to be doing log jams because that's not where a beaver would be damming. That would be a different natural wood scenario. One of the things about building any of these deadwood structures that's really nice is if you give it time, the river will tell you what it wants and where it wants it. You put in your BDAs, you put in some PALs, you put in whatever else, and your first flood event, when all the stuff starts moving, the river shoves it into new places, and you get a log jam here, and you get something else there, and that BDA stays, that BDA blows, and then you watch what happened, and you adapt, and you learn. And I think we only stop making progress when we keep trying to force it back into whatever we imagine is the right configuration of different types of deadwood restoration. Rivers are very powerful. Water is very powerful. I'm a big proponent of put the log in the river. Like, don't overthink this. Beavers do this with much smaller brains than us. So let's just put the log in the river and see what happens, and then make more decisions afterwards. And if it's not getting what we want, change it, but don't overthink it.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Another question, a broader question this time, focusing on, what we have to do in France and in Western Europe to have beaver populations with better health and aquatic environments that are in better health. Are there different things that we can do? Do you have any advice?
Yeah, my main Points of advice are, first, figure out what are like your top 3 challenges you're trying to address. Beavers can help with a lot of things, and you will get all the benefits when the beavers show up. But in terms of getting them back out and getting public support behind them, figure out your top 3 challenges and figure out what specifically about beavers helps with that. If your challenge is wildfire, like read the fire research, look at the fire research, see what goes into that. It's water storage, it's tree chewing, and then talk about those behaviors. Sometimes we out here in the US, people want a lot of fire resistance, but they don't want any flooding and they don't want any tree chewing. And those are the main 2 ways that beavers build fire resistance. And so doing education about that can help people have appropriate expectations of the animal, which I think is one of the biggest predictors of if it's going to be successful or not. Do people actually get what the beavers do? And are people ready for it to not be perfect? Or are they expecting this to be perfect on the first try? And then when it's not perfect, they get frustrated and want to stop working with the beavers. Beavers are slow. They reproduce slow. They build pretty fast, but over time, like it takes a lot of time. And we like to operate on 1-year timescales. I would say the minimum timescale for a beaver is 3 years. And more often than that, it's 5. You got to give them 3 to 5 to see what's going to happen. So manage that expectation, tie it to things that matter, and take data. We have some parts of the US where no one has taken any data locally on what the beavers are doing. And people refuse to look at the data from other parts of the US because they are different settings. And it just slows everything down because now we're like 20 years behind in research and no one's willing to put in the structures until we have local research, and that takes time. And so start taking data now, even if you don't know what you're going to use it for. And that can be just photographs. There's nothing that I use more frequently than photographs because there's so much in there that you can tell after the fact. You can look at the health of the vegetation, you can look at biodiversity, you can look at canopy height, you can look at flood stage. You don't necessarily know that's what you're trying to photograph, just take a photo and do it over and over. Repeat photography is huge. So do that, have strong visuals, have a strong message, and manage your expectations. It is a rodent, not a person.
Thank you very much, Emily. We're going to close our seminar now. Antoine is going to maybe take over for the conclusion. Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to congratulate you all for your very interesting presentations. Let me remind you that everything will be online on the H2O website. Before leaving, I'd like to hand back over to each speaker so that they can give a short conclusion. We'll start with Yoann. Yoann, given everything that you've heard, what would you like to say to conclude? Good question. Well, already I can say that the questions that we're asking in France are being asked everywhere, when it comes to beavers. And that, there's still a lot of work to be carried out, especially working together with other teams. Why not do what others have already tried? And yes, work together with others at European level or at international level. And above all, there's the human side of things, which is, a big side. We have to take that into account properly. And it's not easy. For biologists or ecologists, it's not easy. But it's not easy in other disciplines either. I think the contribution of social and human sciences can help for the future. Thank you, Yoann. Christof, what about you? Yes, I'd just like to say something in relation to what I put in the chat. The most important thing is the human factor. Beavers don't need management. It's the humans that do. What might work in one place might work exactly in a similar place if the owner of that place is different. So the human dimension is very important. So the Americans and English talk about the human dimension. We mustn't forget that. And I think that if we want to go further in the future, and this is what Emily was saying, we've got to get all of the information together. Beavers, there are so many positive factors relating to beavers for us, for our environment, for our own habitat and farming. We mustn't stop talking about these benefits. And the American context is a little bit different compared with us. In Switzerland, Emily, you wouldn't believe the situation in Switzerland. Everything's so small and tight, and also in people's minds. You know, it's a bit different everywhere. But we are realizing, well, 18 years ago when I started work on beavers, we hadn't talked as much about ecosystem services, climate change. And I think that in the future, I'm very positive, in fact. I'm seeing a great future for the environment and for beavers because, you know, we will be changing and adapting. The beavers will be helping us. And, you know, that's something that we need to take. But again, you know, got to keep the human dimension in mind. Thank you very much for that note of hope. Emily, what about you?
Yeah, I would say I would end with to stay, everyone should be staying humble about beavers. They have done this a lot longer than us, and it's hard. And as somebody who has a PhD and who has worked as an engineer, I go out and try to build a beaver dam and it sucks. Like it's terrible. So, you know, stay humble. They have skills that we don't have, and learning to work with that is the smart path forwards, but also to remember we're engineers too, and the land is different than it was when we had a bunch of beavers everywhere. So being creative and using both of our individual strengths as best we can, I think is going to be really important for this. And then also just, I obviously think beavers are very cool. I like them a lot. Not everybody does, and that's okay. You don't need everybody to think they're cool to get big support behind them. We have had so much support for beavers over here from people that honestly don't really like them because they like watching birds, and bird watching is a big part of their identity. And the birds that come to beaver wetlands are so threatened elsewhere. And they're like, you know what, I'm not a fan of this giant rodent, but it makes habitat for the birds I love, so I will deal with the rodent. A lot of people who really don't like swamps and wetlands, they think they're gross, but they like to have that clear, cold water downstream. You don't have to visit the wetland. I disagree. I think they're beautiful, but you don't have to think that. You can choose what parts of the beaver engineering you like, and you don't have to like the beaver. And I think that letting people not like genuinely not like the animal is really helpful because it feels less forceful. Like you don't have to like this animal, but we all like what this animal does. So let's tolerate this animal. Let's work with this animal. If you do like the animal, amazing. Like there's so many people you can talk to about this, but you don't have to. You just have to respect it.
Thank you, Emily. I just want to go back to Samuel. Perhaps he can talk about prospects, just a few words about what you're going to be doing, what you're going to be presenting in the future. Tell us more. Yes, thank you, Antoine. Yes, now, so I work, as I said in my introduction, I work on alternative methods, how we can go about things differently in relation to water. How can we have an alternative view of the world from a deontological point of view? So how can these alternative ways of seeing the world help us to transform institutions, especially when it comes to water governance and management? So the link with the beaver is where you have the interface between beaver mimicry and trying to get beavers back involving questions, broader questions about, you know, how do we go about things with the rest of the living world, you know, and then you can have reconnected approaches of water and land, a bit like, you know, the water that comes out of pipes. So question that. What does it imply on who is concerned, who will be shouldering certain movements? How can that lead to changes or compromise for a specific area? What oppositions are going to be encountered? What about the enablers, the drivers, where you have beaver structures? Before handing over to Claire-Lise, I just want to share something with you. This is my screen. So you can learn about deadwood. Here's Deadwood for Dummies and Beaver Dams for Dummies. We have to remember that we've got to save our rivers. So if you want to save our rivers, we can get help from beavers. They're there to help us. So we should make the most of them and support them when they're coming back to our areas. I'm now going to hand over to Claire-Lise, who's going to conclude and perhaps tell us about the rest of the program. Thank you very much to Yoann, Christof, and Emily for your presentations, for answering all of the questions, because our objective is to have a lot of exchange. Thank you, Emily, especially. It was very early for you, I believe. Thank you, Samuel, for moderating the discussion so well. And thank you to our interpreters who allow us to have very fluid French-English discussions, which is always very important.